pleasure now to introduce Rob Snyder. Rob is the director of the graduate program in American Studies at Rutgers-Newark, where he's worked with journalists, museum curators, and documentarians since the 1980s to share a broad swath of history with the public. He's an historian and associate professor in the Department of American Studies and Arts, Culture, and Media. He earned his doctorate originally in history from New York University. He's on sabbatical this semester, so we are especially appreciative of him having agreed to come back across the river for the morning, so thank you, Rob. He's the author of The Voice of the City, Vaudeville, and Popular Culture in New York, Transit Talk, New York's Bus and Subway Workers Tell Their Stories, and he's the co-author of Metropolitan Lives, The Ashcan Artists and Their New York, which won the Barr Prize from the College Art Association. He wrote, produced, and directed the documentary short City Kids Meet Ashcan Art, which won a Gold Apple Prize from the National Education Media Network. He's consulted and been an interview and research source for the documentary series The Irish in America. He directed research for Rick Burns's film New York, and he's served as a consultant for NPR's Sonic Memorial Project on September 11th and the World Trade Center, which won a Peabody Award. He's worked widely with museums. He co-curated the exhibit for Metropolitan Lives, Ashcan Artists at Their New York, at the National Museum of American Art at the Smithsonian. He's consulted to the Museum of the City of New York for exhibits on the Spanish Civil War and New York City. He formerly edited the Media Studies Journal. He's worked at Newsday, the Journalism Review More, Channel 13. His reviews and his articles have been published in scholarly journals such as the Journal of Urban History, the Journal of American History, Journalism and Reviews in American History, as well as a lot of general interest publications such as the New York Times, The Nation, the Columbia Journalism Review, the Jesuit magazine America, the Jewish Forward, and the Star Ledger, as well as NJN, NPR, the History Channel, and the BBC. He's also the founding editor of Newark Metro, which is published online and won the 2008 Rutgers-Newark Chancellor's Award for Community Engagement in Undergraduate Teaching and Learning. I'm thrilled that he's able to join us today, and I know firsthand from working with him that he's especially proud of and good at working with teachers and students and really values good teaching. So we're thrilled to have you.
Well, as usual, Elizabeth is a little bit too modest because she is one of our very fine doctoral students in American Studies at Rutgers-Newark, and she has a master's in history, and Professor Cornell Chang, who's going to follow along, also is on the history faculty and teaches American Studies. And in this gathering today, we're bringing together the scholars, the teachers, and the general public interest that we really want to make such an important part of the American Studies program. And I thank you for all coming out today to work with us together. Here this morning, I want to talk about how paintings and visual media, photos, cartoons, and sketches can help us become better historians, better interpreters of the past, better teachers of history. I know this because it works, and it's worked for me both in my research and in my teachings. The paintings and the images that we're going to see this morning and that we've seen in the galleries are fragments of the past. They're products of people who gave their ideas, their impressions, their emotions, physical form in photographs, sketches, maps, and more. And we can look at those visual images today to grasp one of the most elusive, but I think most interesting things that we can uncover when we study history: the ideas and feelings of previous generations. You want to know what it was like to look into the face of an actor on a stage in New York City in 1912? I can't think of a photo or a film that does it really well. The technology wasn't there, and the emotional interaction somehow gets lost in the primitive motion pictures. But if you look at this painting here, Everett Shin's Footlight Flirtation, executed in 1912, you can begin to get an idea of how certain performers, particularly in the vaudeville stage, reached out from the stage and actually directly engaged the audience members in front of them. They didn't put on a show about reality that people watched from the audience, but rather they engaged the people in the seats with direct glances, with comments, with asides, with jokes sometimes, that made the audience feel like co-producers of the show when they went to a stage show, particularly a vaudeville show in New York City. When you begin with the kind of observation of that riveting glance, and I admit in the JPEG reproduction, her face is a little less riveting than it is in the painting, but it is amazing to see how she's looking out and making her point. You have the beginning point, the launching pad, if you will, for an examination of theater and the relationship between artists and audiences a century ago. You'd want to build on this painting when you were preparing a lesson by looking at theater critics' reviews, the autobiographies of artists and actors, song sheets and scripts to get the whole story. But what I want to say to you today, that these works of art, these visual impressions of previous generations, are great starting places to begin. Here's an example. Decades ago, I was researching a dissertation on vaudeville, and I was wondering what was the relationship between artists and audiences like. I was in a seminar with a grad student who was writing a dissertation about artists who painted New York City in the early 20th century, the Ashcan artists. She showed me paintings like this one that depicted the interaction between artists and audiences. I pointed out to her that very often the bars, theaters, street corners that the Ashcan artists painted were real places in New York City, and that references to a saloon like the Haymarket or a neighborhood called the Tenderloin would have had all sorts of levels of meaning to people living in New York in 1905 or 1910 that simply wouldn't be apparent to us today. We came away from that exchange knowing a lot more about art and a lot more about urban experiences. And this morning, I hope you will too. We begin very far from the world of footlight flirtation. And there's a piece of me that wants to cue my best Rod Serling Twilight Zone. Meet Daniel and Harriet Lathrop of Albany in New York in a painting commissioned for their wedding anniversary and executed in 1884. They don't know it, but their world is about to come apart. Not just because Mrs. Lathrop is going to die before the painting is completed, but because this painting and its conventions, the formality of the seating, the formality of the dress, the posing of the man with his gloves in his hand because he's out in the world of business as a prosperous businessman that he is, the wife at home not dressed to go out in any way, all of these are parts of conventions of portraiture in the middle and latter part of the 19th century that rich people used to establish their status in their world, both for visitors who would come to their home and also for their future generations within their own family. Looking at them for a minute, you see their kind of upright, very formal way of behaving and presenting themselves. This is as they would wish to be remembered. And yet, here's what's going to happen. All this is going to come apart within one lifetime of the creation of this painting. These folks were painted in the 1880s, a period that historians sometimes call the Gilded Age. That's a period that roughly runs from the 1870s into the 1890s, when great robber barons commanded and profited from rising American industry and gilded themselves with great wealth. This was a period of extraordinary economic inequality. It was also a time of what's sometimes called the Second Industrial Revolution, in which iron, chemical manufacture, and the application of what was for the time advanced technology dramatically drove the growth of the American economy. It's also a time of increasing immigration and urbanization and, especially when we get into the 20th century, enormous political conflict and reform efforts over how to control a society in which cities seem to be the locus of a great array of challenges and which economic inequality seems to be changing the nature of life in America. The Lathrop's world was transformed by what one historian, Tom Bender, has called the first age of globalization. The period from the 1890s to World War I, when people and money and goods moved around the world with transforming speed and intensity. We think of ourselves living in a world of globalization now, but in fact it's probably the second age of globalization in many ways. By the late 19th century, from the 1870s to the early 1890s, the economies of Europe and the United States were in a protracted slump. That was the very difficult aspect of that period. However, at the same time, as I said, there were growths in new forms of industry, in international finance, and agricultural production. When the economic crisis began to ease in the 1890s, immigration picked up. In part, this was because an international economy created instabilities and opportunities that people hadn't seen before. An Italian agricultural worker might be thrown out of work because oranges grown in Florida undercut the price of oranges grown in Sicily. A Jewish artisan in Lodz, Poland, might find himself unable to compete with the price of cloth woven in Connecticut. One answer to the needs of people looking for better economic circumstances in this new global economy was integration. I'm going to leave the bulk of that discussion of integration to Professor Cornell Chang, but one thing I want to say is you cannot underestimate the movement of people and immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century, especially to cities, in transforming the world of the Lathrops, especially in places like downtown Newark, Broad and Market Street about 1900. Look at this picture here and just think about what it begins to tell you about Newark at the dawn of the 20th century. Newark then had a population of about 250,000 that would grow to about 450,000 in the next 2 decades. You can see a density of population, a density of businesses. You can see how people would have been rubbing shoulders with each other in all sorts of new ways, and how folks like the Lathrops would realize, probably with some discomfort, that they had to share their world and their kind of city with new kinds of folks from all around the globe, particularly in the case of Newark, not just to Ireland and Germany, but also Italy, Poland, Russia, in ways that the Lathrops would have found very discomforting. This image, which is widely produced, is also available on postcards. And one of the things to think about is, what was it about the experience of going downtown in the early 20th century that would make a person want to share this in a postcard to someone else? What was it about going downtown that would make it so memorable to folks? This city, this Newark, like many other cities in this period, particularly in the Northeast and the upper Midwest, was not just a place of shopping. It was not just a place of commerce and recreational visits. It was also a place of work. Listen to this testimony from a young Jewish immigrant from Poland, a woman named Sadie Frown, who was interviewed by the magazine The Independent in 1902. I get up at 5:30 in the morning and make myself a cup of coffee on the oil stove. I eat a bit of bread and perhaps some fruit, and then go to work. At 7 o'clock, we're down to our machines, and the boss brings to each one the pile of work that he or she is to finish during the day, what they call in English their stint. This pile is down beside the machine, and as soon as the skirt is done, it is laid on the other side of the machine. Sometimes the work is not all finished by 6 o'clock, and the one who is behind must work overtime. Sometimes one is finished ahead of time and gets away at 4 or 5 o'clock, but generally we are not done till 6 o'clock. So she's talking about an 11-hour workday in a garment manufacturing shop, the kind that could be found in Newark and New York City in the early 20th century. The machines go like mad all day because the faster you work, the more money you get. Sometimes in my haste, I get my finger caught and the needle goes right through it. It goes so quick, though, that it does not hurt much. I bind the finger up with a piece of cotton and go on working. We all have accidents like that. Now, there were 2 really big transforming responses to this. Not the only responses, but 2 that I want to focus on today. And they're not mutually exclusive. One was to go out and have a good time. The other was to try to transform the world that made these inequalities and made this labor system so hard to bear with. This is a picture of trying to get away from this world of hard work into a world of leisure that offered greater freedom for young women like Sadie Frown. The painting is by William Glackens, and it's called At the Beach. Glackens was one of the ashcan artists who painted street scenes in New York City in the early 20th century. I find the ashcan artists utterly fascinating, inspiring, and compelling more than a century after they did their work. All of them came out of journalism, and particularly Glackens was a sketch artist at a newspaper. In the days before photographs were the common way to illustrate newspapers, sketches were employed. to depict scenes on streets. And Glackens was a sketch artist in Philadelphia. But he found the routines of daily journalism too limiting. He wanted to go into some things in greater depth. He also studied fine art, and he came to New York City along with other sketch artists and their mentor, a painter named Robert Henry, and began to try to paint the world of everyday life around them in early 20th century New York. What he's painting here is one of the seaside beach resorts like Coney Island in Brooklyn or South Beach in Staten Island, where young people, young men and young women, found a break from both the workplace and life at home under the thumbs of their parents, their fathers, their brothers, their uncles, anybody who might sort of keep them in line and try to control them. Think about Sadie Frown and her 11-hour workday. Then note that at the beach, she's got all sorts of opportunities to get away from the constraints of her workplace and her neighborhood. Note also how very far we are from the world of the Lathrops in Albany. This is 1912. The Lathrops were painted in 1885. Look at the kind of clothing people were wearing. We today think of these as almost full bodysuits, right? But compared to what the Lathrops were wearing, these are incredibly form-fitting. Also, look at some of the social interaction that you see. Men and women right next to each other in the water, on the beach, on the boardwalk up here. This is a new world in which socializing outside the home is dramatic and liberating and pleasurable all at the same time. And men had always had these opportunities. In the 19th century city, there were tons of bars and theaters and brothels where men could get out of the restrictions of family life. By the early 20th century, women have that too. And this is one of the key things that marks their transition from the world of the Lathrops to the modern world of change and more complex relations between men and women that we know today. Now, as I said, one response to the world that Sadie Frown found herself in was to have a good time. Another response took the form of politics, formal politics, and it's not mutually exclusive. Young women like Sadie Frown could go to the beach to enjoy themselves, but also march on Union picket lines outside the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Company. And in fact, in the early years of the 20th century, as we move from what historians sometimes call the Gilded Age into what they call the Progressive Era, the era between about 1900 and World War I, we see radical and even reforming responses to the inequalities and social problems wrought by industrial capitalism, urbanization, and immigration. This was an international phenomenon. It's a mistake to think of it just with response to the United States of America. There were dynamic exchanges between reformers in the United States and Britain, between academics in America and in Germany. You can look to Argentina, you can look to Japan and see them all wrestling with the same questions, sometimes coming up with different answers, but always wrestling with the same issues. Let me give you an example. Irish Republicanism, the insurrectionary movement to liberate Ireland from British rule, had a long history in the 19th century. One of the great Irish rebels, James Connolly, an Irish Republican and a socialist, lived in the Bronx and in Newark. He gave speeches out in Washington Park and then went back to die, executed for his part in an uprising against British rule in 1916. Italian radicals who moved back and forth like Italian laborers between the United States and Italy had similarly transnational lives. Think of this one guy, Gaetano Bresci, an Italian, immigrated to Paterson, New Jersey, and worked as a silk weaver. He was an active member of the city's anarchist community, and he helped found a newspaper there called La Questione Sociale. He continued to follow political events in Italy, and he got furious in 1898 when he read of an Italian workers' and peasants' demonstration that was suppressed in the city of Milan. He returned to Italy in 1900 from Paterson and assassinated the King of Italy, King Umberto I, who had decorated a general who presided over the massacre of the Italian workers. Bresci was imprisoned in Italy, and he died while he was incarcerated in Italy. The authorities said this was a suicide. This is an extremely dubious claim. But the key thing was his wife ran a restaurant, even after his death, in Cliffside Park, New Jersey, for years, until the police hounded her out and sent her fleeing to California. Similarly, another anarchist, Carlo Tresca, immigrated to the USA, lived briefly in New York City in 1904, then moved around the country as an organizer and a journalist and an agitator in Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and then back to 1913 as the editor of the newspaper Avvenire, The Future. It was suppressed. He later launched another newspaper, Il Martello, The Hammer. He was active in the Industrial Workers of the World, an anarcho-syndicalist labor organization. He was a leader in the Patterson Silk Strike of 1913. He was described as a man with a big heart and plenty of guts, who had all the right enemies. He also had many sweethearts, including Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, one of the great. Tresca was eventually assassinated. He had foes in the mob, he had foes in the Communist Party. All of them were blamed. There was some speculation as well that he was killed by a jealous husband. This is plausible, but probably not true. In all likelihood, he was killed by the mob because he was getting in the way of their operations. You also had, at the same time, an element of radicalism that spanned everything from anarchism to socialism to more radical forms among Jewish immigrants. You can exaggerate this sometimes. There were many aspiring businessmen in the Jewish community who tried to get ahead by doing better in business rather than transforming society. But socialism was still an important strain in Jewish immigrant life in cities like Newark and New York. The culture and politics of Jewish socialists was highly international. Let me just read this paragraph from the historian Jonathan Frankel. One political subculture came into being in Vilna, Minsk, Bialystok, and the East End of London and the Lower East Side of New York. Its lingua franca was Yiddish, its economic base the clothing industry and the sweatshop, its politics the running dispute and constant interaction between socialist internationalism and Jewish nationalism. Its organizational expression, the Yiddish press, the public meeting, the trade union, the ideologically committed party, and, where relevant, the armed self-defense unit. Successful political innovations in the Lower East Side were adopted in the Pale of Settlement, that's in Eastern Europe, and vice versa. The politically involved youth passed restlessly from one center to another, spending years now in Russia, now in London, New York, Galicia, or Palestine. Nothing if not peripatetic, and yet moving across 3 continents, they always remained within the same Russian Jewish environment. The Bolsheviks Leon Trotsky and Nikolai Bukharin, for example, both lived in New York City before returning to Russia after the revolution, each to meet a different tragic end as the Soviet communists devoured their founding generation. These kind of currents of radicalism and reform were strong from the 1890s to 1914 until the outbreak of the First World War. And one of the things that held movements together was magazines and newspapers. Magazines and newspapers were more than instruments of information. They were movement-building publications. They sought to inform people and create political communities. One example of this is the magazine The Masses, edited in New York City from 1911 to 1918. It was an eclectic magazine published in New York, edited by Greenwich Village radicals, beginning with Max Eastman and then art director John Sloan, one of the Ashcan artists. The image on the cover of this magazine refers to the Ludlow Massacre in Colorado in April of 1914, when the National Guard fired on striking miners and their families, killing 14 people. More died in fighting that followed. This is another example of how we are very far from the world of the Lathrops. The Lathrops were protected in their home, in their parlor, in Albany, New York. This miner is fighting in the ruins of his own home, his dead child under his arm, and he's blasting away with a revolver. One of the things that's easily forgotten in America is how violent economic conflict, industrial relations, and class conflict were in the early years of the 20th century in a way that's almost forgotten now. What emotions might this image have prompted in readers, both among radicals who read the magazine and people who just chanced across it on a newsstand? Home is in the middle of this photograph, in the middle of this image, as much as it is in the Lathrop's image. But home becomes a very different kind of place. It becomes a place of violence and slaughter and self-defense. I want to emphasize that not all political actions in the first part of the 20th century, from 1900 to the eve of World War II, were as angry as Ludlow and the masses. As I said before, there were settlement houses in Britain and the United States. There was a rise of the idea of professionally organized universities applying expertise to solve social problems in scientific, politically neutral ways. There's a great book about this called Atlantic Crossings by the historian Daniel Rogers. At the same time, magazines, publications that addressed pressing issues in the first decade or so of the 20th century also found their expression in magazines that looked at the issue of race in the United States. Nowhere more importantly than in the magazine The Crisis, which was the magazine of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Again, it's a classic impulse of the progressive era and before, found a publication to knit together a movement. In the case of the NAACP, The Crisis is founded in 1910, 1 year after the birth of its parent organization. It's very much a part of progressive era history and African American history. Part of the progressive era in the sense that it takes the form of analytical journalism and photography to enlighten and persuade. Broadly middle class in its orientation, its existence as a magazine was made possible by black and white reform constituencies concentrated in northern cities, especially New York. Also broadly middle class, I'd argue, in its faith, in its readership, in intellect, and in uplift. It's a very respectable magazine, even though in some of its editorials, written by its editor, W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the great African-American intellectuals and activists of the 20th century, it fiercely criticizes all sorts of aspects of American society. I must say that I looked at a lot of covers of the masses, and there's a wonderful website done by Brown Universities on magazines in the early 20th century. And up to now, I'll be honest with you, most of what I knew about the magazine The Crisis, I knew by reading excerpts from The Crisis. I didn't look at the pictures in The Crisis, I read reprints of the editorials. When you start to look at it as a collection of pictures, as you start to look at the whole magazine, you find a much more complex publication, a much more complex view of the world than you would if you just confined yourself to the editorials. On one hand, there are photographs like this on the cover. This is an image of an elderly African-American man. Clearly, he's somebody who's in 1917. He was alive in slavery times, and it's a dignified image, much more dignified than you'd find in many of the racist stereotypes of African Americans at the time. But, and this is what shocked me, a quarter of the pictures on the cover of The Crisis in these same years, the World War I years, are pictures of beautiful women. There's just no two ways about it. They're beautiful African American women, but they tend to be light-skinned, they tend to be very fashionably dressed, they tend to be very middle class in their demeanor. If you look back in the ad pages, there are ads for all sorts of ways of straightening your hair and lightening your complexion. The politics, the cultural politics of the magazine is a bit more complicated than we would have thought. At the same time, if you go inside it, you find this kind of scientific social science attention to detail that's very much part of the progressive movement. This map here shows African American routes of migration out of the Deep South and the disasters of the Deep South. You can see boll weevil, floods, segregation in all these areas of the South, leading up north in the years 1916 to 1917. This is the beginning of the Great Migration that's going to transform African American life, and it's going to transform American cities. And it's pushed by racial oppression in the South, and it's pulled from the North by the openings of jobs to feed war production and labor shortages that surround the First World War. If you also look at the crisis in these World War I years, you see enormous attention to black men as soldiers, not just in the United States Army, because the crisis and Du Bois in these years supported the U.S. war effort and the Allied war effort against Germany before the United States got into a war, in a belief that this war could be turned somehow into a struggle that would reduce racism, reduce colonialism, reduce racial inequalities around the world. I think he was mistaken in that, but there's no question that Du Bois believed that. But you see not only pictures of U.S. soldiers, but in other issues, pictures of African soldiers in European armies. Now, on one hand, these pictures can be read in one way. They show Africans doing hard and dirty fighting against Germans on the Western Front in all sorts of places. But what they also show, and this is what they would have meant also to black viewers, is they show black men defeating white men in battle again and again and again, haranguing German prisoners, throwing back German offensives. And they also show black American men in French army formations that are integrated, something you would never have found in the United States Army in the same period. They also show cartoons. This is not the greatest of cartoons, but it's really, really, really revealing. The ship is called USS Negro Patriotism and Loyalty. But down below, that ship is being sunk. Divers are boring through the hull of the ship to sink it. And what are those divers labeled? Prejudice, lynch law, segregation. Du Bois editorially supported the U.S. war effort, yet he realized that the third-class citizenship that African Americans enjoyed in the United States was going to undermine any African American patriotism and support for the war. And he was caught between these two very different forces. And it was a really difficult place to be. And yet, here he is in this cartoon trying to argue that it's in the best interest of white America to reduce prejudice, lynch law, and segregation if white America wants to maintain Negro patriotism and loyalty. At the same time, you could find in this same issue an extraordinary editorial by Du Bois in which he talks about how racism and imperialism were the cause of World War I, and at the same time how Africans and people in the Middle East have an extraordinary stake in this conflict when it emerges, that while all eyes are focused on the Western Front and the tremendous slaughter in the trenches, there are implications in this war for Africa that most Americans didn't think through. In 1914, when the Great War came, it's often discussed with regard to that Western Front in Europe, but as I said, Du Bois recognized how it had profound implications for both Africa and the Middle East. It also had profound implications for the United States and the life in American cities. Americans were divided over World War I, and those divisions sometimes emerged sharpest in cities. Irish Americans were often anti-war. A war in which the United States would be allied with Britain did not, to them, look like a good war to be part of. German Americans were deeply torn. They didn't want to go to war against Germany. And there's nothing more heart-wrenching than reading German American newspapers from this period as people try to come to grips with this. Russian Jewish immigrants felt that a war in which the United States would be allied with the Tsar in the cause of freedom was a contradiction in terms. So particularly among Jews and left-wing Jews, there was not substantial support for the war effort. On the other hand, among families like the Lathrops, and I don't know about them personally, but older Anglo-American families, particularly those people who are elites on Wall Street, there was a sense that the war was well worth fighting. And there were progressives, people who had agitated for social change, like Du Bois and the philosopher John Dewey, who supported the war because they thought that somehow it could be turned to positive ends. They were strongly criticized by another writer and intellectual of the period, Randolph Bourne, who argued that this was simply a delusion and that this war, this great war that everyone called it when it emerged in 1914, would really bring an end to the ferment and the changes that had characterized international life and American life in the first 10 or 15 years of the 20th century. Bourne was right. The descent and the social ferment of the progressive era came to an end in World War I, partly through strategies of propaganda, partly through deliberate efforts to manufacture consent, partly through repression of certain activities. The Espionage Act of 1917 provided up to 20 years in prison and a $10,000 fine for aiding the enemy or obstructing armed forces. It also allowed the government to ban treasonous materials from the mails. Notice, they didn't ban the publication. They said you just couldn't distribute it through the mail. It meant the end of any kinds of critical publications that opposed the war. That happened for the masses, the magazine that I showed the Ludlow cover on, but it also happened for a small German language socialist newspaper published right here in Newark, New Jersey. The Sedition Act of 1918 outlawed the use of language in contempt of the government, the Constitution, or the flag. This repressive mood followed through in the years right after World War I as well. The socialist Eugene Debs was imprisoned. The anarchist radical Emma Goldman was deported. If you think of the world of New York City in the early 20th century as being torn between Times Square in a world of entertainment and Union Square in a world of politics, the balance shift towards Times Square in the years right after World War I. At the same time, the U.S. becomes very powerful. It becomes a creditor nation. Everybody owes us money after World War I. And New York and Wall Street begin to surpass London as an international finance center. The first age of globalization came to an end in World War I. Even before the war had started, different nations had begun to seal themselves off and try to cultivate their own narrow advantage. Only in our own time, only a century later, has global trade and immigration equaled what it was at the dawn of the 20th century. And it behooves us to remember how that first era of globalization ended in the Great War and what might be called the First Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. What it was like to live through this great transformation was recorded by Joseph Stella, an Italian immigrant born in 1877, came to New York in the 1890s, and this panel, executed in between roughly 1920 and 1922, is called The Voice of New York Interpreted. He looks at New York City in a very new way, artistically. Stella was an amazing artist. He did very realistic sketches of immigrant workers in Pittsburgh for a Reform magazine. That's classic progressive era journalism. Yet he also leaned towards, in this series of painting, what's called futurism in art historical circles. He was more than an artist who marched to his own beat, one critic put it. He was a one-man band who marched to his own beat. And in this image right here, he broke New York down into different parts, and one of them is Brooklyn Bridge. Now, what's striking about this is it's not a realistic picture of Brooklyn Bridge. You have to look closely at it to even begin to recognize Brooklyn Bridge. But as you begin to look at it, you start to see all sorts of things. This is Brooklyn Bridge from the Brooklyn side. The skyscrapers of Manhattan, and these were the early skyscrapers by the time he executed this painting, were on the far side of the bridge. Manhattan is the destination in this painting, not Brooklyn. How are we to understand these skyscrapers? What are they? Well, one interpretation has been that these are like the cathedrals of our time. Is that a positive judgment or a negative judgment? Certainly in the Gilded Age, cathedrals of commerce was a phrase that was often used to describe department stores and skyscrapers. Is he approving or disapproving of these cathedrals of commerce? What's leading up ahead? Is it a settled life or a cacophonous life that's going to pull you in all sorts of directions? Is it a stormy future up there, or is there a blue sky beyond everything else? What's emphasized in this picture and what's missing? what fascinates me is the ashcan artists in painting New York City just before Stella executed this painting put people, recognizable individual people, like that first woman we saw, the actress, at the center of urban transformations. Stella puts sensations that an individual might feel, feelings, responses, subjective responses that he feels, but he's in the middle of this, not other people. And it's a striking difference when you begin to think about what's put in and what's left out. Is this the end of an era that begins in the Gilded Age, a continuation of some things that we saw in the Progressive era and the Gilded Age, and abandonment of others? I leave that to you to think about, because I think this is one of the ways in which art can look in two directions. It can look backward and forward, and to look at this painting, by the way, in the light of the same images that Joseph Stella did for the Pittsburgh survey, which are these very realistic looking heads of immigrant workers in Pittsburgh, it's only 20 years earlier that he was doing that, is really to see the enormous artistic range he had, but also the variety of responses that one artist could have to cities in the 20th century. So this era comes to an end in World War I. There are aftershocks from it. Many of the people who were prominent in the progressive era politically came back in the New Deal and were active in the Roosevelt administration. Settlement houses remained fixtures in cities and provided a degree of stability in changing neighborhoods in the years after World War II and even today. My son studied music at a music school in New York City that was founded in a settlement house. It's a wonderful school and a great inheritance. At the same time, if you recall, when Elena Kagan was nominated for the Supreme Court, the fact that she'd done her undergraduate thesis at Princeton on the New York socialists in the era of World War I was a little bit too much for some people. So all sorts of contests about who's loyal and who's not echo down from the past to the present. Art like this painting and the ephemera of newspaper sketches and cartoons bequeaths to us ways of seeing, ways of representing urban life, ways of engaging cities in an era when the global and the local collided in fascinating and compelling ways on the streets of American cities. New York and Newark, from the Gilded Age to World War I, drew much of their energy from the fact that they were cities in the world, transformed by the collision between international movements of people and ideas and artwork and song and paintings, and the very specific contexts of urban neighborhoods. At the same time, cities like Newark and New York were cities in the United States, and the mobilization of industries and people and ideas to fight World War I diminished much of the spirit of reform and radicalism that distinguished cities in the early 20th century. Almost a century later, it's a reminder of the precarious balance between cities, nations, and the world around them. Thank you.